All right. Welcome back to another episode of Feeding Curiosity, everyone. Today's episode is kind of a trampoline of sorts from the most recent blog I did on kind of humanizing AI and things like that. The core of why I wrote that article was actually before DeepSeek was launched, but it was mostly response to the new Trump administration putting 500 billion, I think was the number, into AI research. Is a big conglomerate of between like OpenAI and a couple other companies, but the big one being OpenAI getting a huge amount of money over the next probably 4 years. And at the core of it was me worried that all these companies, like AI is the ultimate tool if you take the corporate perspective or the government perspective. You can do more with less people, and I think that missing fundamental. um, and kind of what we were saying earlier, we were just kind of talking, Joe, is like where easily we can slot in this idea of, well, that means we can actually try to do universal basic income. And I fundamentally don't agree with that either. If you take a perspective of like human well-being or human flourishing, if we use positive psychology terms, because if you just say it's fine, you don't need to work and do something productive to society, you can just get money from the government because we're productive enough as it is. It sounds horrible. It sounds dystopian as shit is really what it comes down to. And so this conversation was kind of the launching point of, okay, if AI is not going anywhere, and if just rejecting it wholesale is likely not a smart option, how do we start a conversation is that you can create a framework to use the AI as a tool and not atrophy the things that are uniquely good, like human skills, so that you can do the things that you are either uniquely good at or the interests that you are most gravitate towards.
There's definitely the thing that makes me hopeful about, or at least is interesting about the advent of things like ChatGPT, is that a lot of the corporate speak can be automated. I don't like having to write up emails with things like, I hope everything is well since we last spoke, and please refer to my last email.
It's
this
so
kind
fake.
of way of talking, this
Yes.
very mechanical, there's a canned answer for everything. Let's circle back to that. All of this corporate speak, I hate. I can't stand it.
Mhm.
It seems to me to be a kind of speaking in another person's words and turning off the thinking and providing somebody with an object that has nothing to do with what you really believe about a given situation. Right? It's a canned answer.
Yep.
Now, the fact that ChatGPT is good at that and can pass as a human indicates to some degree that you're not thinking originally, right? That if ChatGPT isn't really thinking, it's just a probabilistic game. One word is coming after the next. It's the most likely word to come after the next, given all the other words that have come before. And that produces corporate speak clearly and perfectly, then maybe corporate speak itself is not actually a kind of thinking. And so if that's true, I mean, Eric Weinstein made the same argument, or a very similar one, on a podcast, I think with Duncan Trussell. But I like the idea of clearing away all the untruths of speech. Untrue meaning like disconnected from yourself, or it's not a sincere expression that you can right, hand that off to somebody else and spend my time writing in a way that's genuine.
Yeah, and I think what you can kind of boil some of this down with is that prior to this moment, we've had multiple industrial revolutions, right? And so it's like, to some degree, you can compare it to that. It's going to be different, obviously. You go through the industrial revolution, you get a whole bunch of technologies that help you do manual labor more effectively. And you could rally against it and say, oh my God, you're removing something human about doing things with our hands. But then when you let reality take hold, of course you're going to use the machines to do your job better because you don't want your back to hurt, or you would just want to be able to get more done with a certain level of scale. So you just have to do these things. And kind of what you're saying in this sense with like ChatGPT and business speak is kind of the same thing. In a world where it's become bloated with middle managers and bureaucrats, now we can offload a lot of this stuff to a ChatGPT like model, and maybe you have a couple supervisors who, manage the documents or see like go through the outputs, right? Effectively, they're editors to make sure that there's not errors or things that shouldn't be said or whatever. That's fine. I think that's a good use of our time, right?
Yeah.
and maybe they could go do something else with their time that they would rather go do instead of getting stuck in some sort of middle management position. So I think it's a blessing and curses is really what this comes down to. And it's just, how do we leverage these things? Because I just see so many people just saying, oh my God, AI equal bad. Or there's the other side of this, the techno optimists who are just like, this is going to be the best thing ever. And it's always going to be somewhere in the middle of all those things. And I think if you do use it smartly, it will be a force multiplier in the sense that if you know how to ask questions, because effectively that's what a lot of these things are, is tools that you ask questions to. So to some degree, to use them well, you have to know how to ask a good question, which I think most of us are woefully inadequate at doing, even at the best of times. So you need to be able to think at different logical levels to be able to use these things effectively, or at least look at them skeptically instead of just being like, oh, if I type in a thing, it tells me the truth every time, which we know is not true.
It's weird. I want to pick up on the point you mentioned there about being able to ask good questions and how we're woefully unable. It's more than just being able to ask a good question. It's asking what defines good here is ChatGPT, what its nature is, because you're not asking ChatGPT necessarily the same kind of question that you would ask your priest, or in the way that you might talk to another human being, where you give perhaps the context of your life before you give them the question so that they can give you the kind of advice that you're really looking for, something that's beneath the surface that words can't quite capture.
Yeah, that's
Whereas
true.
ChatGPT is something that needs a specific kind of language in order to communicate with it. It's not just being able to learn good questions. It's a special set of questions that you need to be able to ask.
Yes.
And so that means that you need a new kind of theory of mind. All right. Because if traditional theory of mind is how I make a model out of your mind, and then I ask a question in a way that you can understand me, right? I have to do that for something that doesn't actually have a mind.
Right.
About it's a machine. It's a new kind of object.
Right.
Scare quotes object
Right.
in my experience that I'm communicating with. Right. So you see, it's not that I can just so easily use my understanding of myself and my understanding of you and other people in order to get a habit of communication.
Yeah, you're
it
totally
generally
right.
Works across persons. It's that now I have to bring this that might not actually work with something like ChatGPT.
Totally. We can use a whole bunch of shorthand because of our body languages, or just being able to say like, oh, you're a human like me, so I can jump through a whole bunch of hoops without having to explain certain thought processes, because humans think generally similar to each other, or like understand certain contextual clues. It's like when you ask, an easy example of this is when ChatGPT was first released, it wasn't connected to the internet. So there was like a cutoff date from what data set it had available to it. So if you asked it anything, I think it was at 2020 or something like that, it was like mid 2020. If you asked anything newer than that, it would have no reference to be able to answer that question. And so you had to keep in mind, okay, what does it know? Is it kind of, it sounds so weird to say it that way. Even to call it an it is in some sense is weird. And it's only gotten better, obviously, at being able to do those things, but it's still not perfect, I would say. If you tell it to summarize writing or something like this, is that it gives a lot of samey answers. Like it's like the tone it's like everything is just squashed into this really, I don't even know if flat is the right word for it, but it comes off as not very human. Like it's human in a very general sense, because it's like if you take a sum average of, I don't know, a very large amount of how humans talk, yeah, that makes sense, but it doesn't feel very natural.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
It doesn't feel natural. ChatGPT uses our input to create its output, Right? So we give it all the language. We give it writings after writing after writing. It takes that and then it uses probabilities to come up with a string of sentences in response to whatever the way in which you worded your question. Now, that means that in some sense, all of the language that it can use has already been provided. It's not the creator of language. It's an editor or reorganizer of language.
Yeah.
Imagine that there's a process to creating a word. And that process stems from experience itself, all the way up the sense perceptions, all the way up through a feeling it out, a kind of what's the tip of your tongue, maybe even experience where you're trying to find the right word for something. Eventually, you may coin a word.
Mm-hmm.
Slang is like this. We're constantly coining words and, yeeting something. It means
yeah. Yeah, that's
right?
good.
Right, if you yeet something,
Yeah, right.
you're like chucking something. You're throwing
Yeah.
another is right.
It's like a verb and a word at the same time.
Yeah. Okay, so onomatopoeia is another good example of this. It's relating, it's signifying something directly in experience.
Right.
And it's transmuting that, it's warping that into a word to use it. But if ChatGPT doesn't have experiences, where's it drawing its thing from? Well, it can't.
Right.
It draws its language from our language. We gave it the thing. What's lacking, most ironically, unnoticed by people who are in the GPT AI space.
Yeah, the tech sphere of this stuff.
Right, is it the very thing that they think is becoming conscious is definitely lacking consciousness because it's not pulling that from it.
That would be interesting. Is like could it fabricate words that fit better than what we right? Like, I know that's
could it create a new word that better fits a particular thing
right.
we're trying to describe than a word that we have now? The answer is no, not without us telling it.
Right. We'd have to invent any new words. So therefore it's already lacking in it. See, and that in and of itself, I think, is the fundamental issue of all this stuff, right? Because now we're creating this symbiotic loop, right? Where we've inputted data into these models. It outputs more information, but it's self-contained. It can't have its own epiphanies or its own ways of connecting dots without humans putting new data into that to feed into that loop to reinforce its model in new ways.
It's Luciferian in a mythical sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's a decoupled linguistic intellect.
Interesting.
Right? Decoupled from anything like sense perceptions, where a lot of what human beings do is keep things linked back to something like an experience. Now you can decouple yourself and you can go off into this space where you're doing corporate speak or using a whole bunch of words that you don't even know their meanings. And you become in action a postmodernist like Derrida, where you think that all language refers to all other language. There is no bottom. There's no reality underneath these sorts of things. And all words are intrinsically lies in some sense because they can't refer to something real, something truly real. But Derrida doesn't pick up on the fact that consciousness is underneath all that. All these words they are more than something. They are more than consciousness. That's where they come from. So you left it right out. You left the most fundamental thing to being alive, to being, out of your equation.
Right.
And it's still out of the equation in ChatGPT.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's not coining words. I don't think maybe it can do that. If I understand this correctly, ChatGPT doesn't actually know what a word is.
Yeah, that's
it can't give you word counts. It's only like probabilities of one token following from the next.
Yes.
And the space is equivalent to A, B, C, D, and so on.
It's like mathematical probabilities of like it indexes a bunch of words and then it just looks like if the word is there's like a probability tree of all these different words that could be next to based on the context. It will select the thing that seems most right, but it doesn't actually know what those words are.
But it's even more than that. If it was operating on that foundation, it could still give you a word count.
That's true.
But ChatGPT can't give you a word count. And the reason it can't give you a word count is because the word isn't the building block for the sentences and paragraphs that it uses.
I think from what I've heard, this might not be ChatGPT, but the underlying math is it takes words and turns it into a number. So it doesn't actually even know it just has an association with a number that equals a word we can read, but it doesn't know. It just turns language into mathematics effectively and probability.
Well, so maybe I don't know what that means for whether or not it could coin a word, but
yeah, I don't know.
As far as so I'm thinking about Owen Barfield, who was I'm reading his book, Saving the Appearances right now, which is a philosophy book. He's one of the Inklings, so he wrote with Tolkien and
oh, really?
Yeah, I think C.S. Lewis or Tolkien.
Lewis was friends with Tolkien at the time.
Yeah, one of them said that Barfield was like one of his best teachers.
Wow.
And the whole book goes in a different direction. It deals with the same problem that Derrida was dealing with, but takes a different approach.
Different fork.
So Derrida is like, all words can't refer to any underlying reality. That underlying reality is intrinsically opaque to us, and that any attempt to classify reality is to leave something out, is to marginalize something. And therefore, if you wanted something like a perfect representation of reality, you would have to include all of reality itself in every representation. So you need to get at the truth, you need to dissolve all conception. Okay, so the boundaries between everything need to be dissolved. Right, everything needs to go away. So the differences between male and female need to be dissolved, among many things. Right, so all this is following from Derrida and other postmodern thinkers, but you can see how it's the thing in itself, whatever that reality is, right? When I try to say woman or even say, then I leave some number of things out in that statement.
Right.
It doesn't capture all of whatever that thing is in itself. It's a simplification, an oversimplification in his thinking.
Derrida would say.
Where Barfield says something similar, but it's that, yes, he's not talking so much about language, but he's saying that we have the appearances, and we have all these sensations, right, and sense perceptions that sense perceptions and sensations that are forming the appearance of something. Whatever that is. I see a can of like off-brand LaCroix in front of me, and I have all of these things coming together in an unconscious process that produces this object.
Right.
Now, this object that I'm seeing, I don't see the atoms,
right,
or quarks, or I don't see the air moving around it.
Right.
Right. That sort of sets the boundary between where it is and other things maybe. There's a lot left out of the appearance itself. And in a strange way that parallels what Derrida was talking about. Where for Barfield, it's like, no, it's the great mystery behind all things. And the fact that it's humbling but not humiliating for Barfield. And that the very idea that you could have a perfect representation of whatever the thing is a very new concept in history. And I haven't gotten quite to this part yet, but he's saying that this is a quirk of modernism in the industrial age and these things.
Yeah, I feel like it's like our obsession with trying to think of the world in mechanistic way of like at every layer as you stack up reality, it all should flow in a logical sense.
It good but overzealous emphasis on objectivity in some sense.
Right.
That when we discovered science and how to do it and operate and how powerful it was and how it gave us sort of dominion over matter, this was all very impressive and it improved the material conditions of our lives. But it became hubristic to believe, in that it believed it could perfectly represent reality.
Right.
Because even if you take this, I mean, I think of this from a kind of consciousness perspective. Science is a subset of conscious experience. If I'm looking through a microscope at like an electron microscope at, some protein or something, or some compound. I'm still looking through the
Right.
microscope.
You still need an observer to do that.
Right. There's still an observer. Right. So the fundamental bit of reality is consciousness, as far as I'm concerned. Everything else is an attempt to or feelers that we're putting out into reality to try to get a sense of what it is.
Right.
But you can't, when you try to reduce all truth to what can be produced by science, then you actually cut off a whole bunch of it.
Right.
Right?
Totally. And that's a whole different layer that's to some degree unquantifiable. And I think that kind of gets at a lot of the hype around all of these things is that even if people think of it now, right, it's really good at doing a very narrow subsection of things, right? Putting text on screen or creating summarizations or, starting a rough draft maybe is even that. But even then, there's still, it's not, it won't ever do anything original per se.
Well, okay, so can ChatGPT tell you? It might be able to. The answer is no, it can't. It can't actually do anything. It can only edit. It can only rearrange because we're giving it the experience. We're the ghost in the machine.
Yeah. It still requires a human input for you to make sense of the output, right? Like there's no recursive algorithm that it can take. You could start it saying, hey, work on this, and then just work on something in the background and be like, I've figured out a thing for you. It can't do that yet. It's a single task, single output, and it doesn't really remember, or it does, but there's a limitation before it starts hallucinating or whatever it is.
Right. What I'm trying to get at here is the idea that there's this. I'm elaborating on the coining a word thing.
Yeah.
That there's the ChatGPT isn't producing or coining a word because we're the ones that provided an experience that it would then use that we would use and it can't use
to
generate that
meaning.
word. Right. And that makes it good for a certain kind of language that can be easily applied and rearranged.
And things that are already known.
Yep, it can play with what's already known, but it's not good for the kind of language that requires a bottom-up, often unconscious process to produce the expression that you're looking for.
And maybe you're hitting as to why people in the art communities rally against AI art wholesale. Anything that gets close to, because artists are finally in tune with things, or at least the impressions of what art does. And to say that a machine output would be anything equivalent to like a Leonardo or whatever would be like blasphemy.
What the artists are doing is reaching into the unconscious and pulling out images to express something that they don't have words for.
Yes.
And so to produce those images requires, first off, a problem that's so complex that you can't understand it with your language, but instead you're trying to intuit it. You're trying to, what's this experience? What is it that I'm seeing here?
Right.
How do I make sense of this? And in that process, images, some of which are ancient, right, and distilled in us from experience, they're a distillation of the experience of your entire lineage. Using those in a new way by bringing them into contact with the experiences across your entire life, direct things, not from the lineage, but from this present moment in the course of your development, in order to make sense of something you don't understand. Stable diffusion. Don't have a collective nor personal unconscious to draw from. They do the same thing that ChatGPT does and take what's been given to it to produce images. And if art is an intimate thing, right, where you are really in yourself, discovering the good, the bad, the ugly,
things you understand,
these things, to commodify that, to corporatize it, to make it into these sort like stickers that you sell for $3 on the side that you stick on a stop sign, whatever it happens to be, this ringing it out.
Yes.
Right,
I think ringing it out, that is a really, it's like a shallow version of it.
It's a bastardization
of
the process, and it makes a mockery in some sense of the process of this creation, right? If what art's purpose in some sense is, it's more complicated than saying a simple purpose, but if its purpose is taking the unknown, the most unknown, and bringing it into our understanding, right? That it doesn't have the consciousness, the ability to go to some unknown and turn it into a known.
Yeah, and rearrange it in different ways.
It's all the way of thinking about that whole layer of AI is something like the new neocortex, another layer, right? All the layers of the brain are taking things from the bottom and drawing them upwards into greater levels of abstraction and
that's a good way to put it.
Explicitness and manipulability. And it's doing that on the layer of cortex about what we already have.
Right. Because this thing would be better at just remembering certain facts or certain whatever. And that if you ask it, like, that's why it's really good for certain things. Like, you just ask it a thing and it's like, oh, this definition equals that or whatever, right? Like, it's really good at just like helping you remember certain things. And I think that's why the way I see a lot of these things is more of like, it's a supercharged assistant in a sense of like, hey, you know what you're working on and what you're looking for. And it's like, hey, can you find me these things? Kind of like the app I told you about, the Consensus AI, where it's specifically designed around research papers. And you can type in really specific questions and it'll give you summaries of different white papers that have been done on hyper-specific topics. And I think that's why these types of algorithms are going to be really good for those kinds of things. When you start, instead of taking these super broad data sets of like all of human knowledge, but now you start like slicing it smaller and get it really good at telling you specific bits of information, you'll start seeing different types of impacts on these things. The AI thing that'll, like Cortana or Jarvis from Marvel, right? Or Halo and Marvel respectively. It's like those are like the sci-fi versions of these things, but to say we'll get there is, I don't know, still in the realm of sci-fi. Just like if what you're saying too is like the level of compute you need to simulate reality, because it sounds like that's what you'd need it to be able to do if you'd want it to at least emulate some human level intelligence.
It would need, and yes, it would need to be able to simulate reality, which it is all, it's representing reality, yes, but at it's representations of reality. What it's definitely not doing is synthesizing the different ways in which you can represent reality. Right. So consciousness is something like that. Consciousness is really, it's bringing all of these things together into one. And so I'm hearing and seeing and whatever, tasting, smelling, and thinking, right? I can think, and that's an aspect of consciousness. It's a higher level in some sense. Thinking is taking what consciousness is bringing together, and then identifying small elements of that, of consciousness, and then pulling them out and creating objects and manipulating.
Could you say like thinking is the next level from the base senses, right? From like sight, sound, smell, touch, whatever. Then you have thinking that gets layered on top of that as a like if you think it just from like a organizing function and a problem solving in a dynamic environment. That's what the point is, right? To have all those senses and then adding thinking on top of it is a way, as a survival mechanism, to navigate a harsh and complex world.
Yeah. Yep. It's not necessarily the thinking. Okay, so 3 layers of memory: procedural, episodic, and semantic. When we're talking about thinking, we usually mean semantic memory, right? Language-based, a voice in your head, hopefully your own voice and not a billion others, unless you're really creative. But there's procedural memory at the bottom, right? This is memory having to do with action, habits, how to ride a bike, saying, calling out the steps to riding a bike and maybe having memorized those isn't going to help you.
This is something that's like we're finding out is a huge limitation. Procedural memory, like riding a bike, is super easy for us humans once we learn it. But teaching a robot to do those kinds of things, right? Like, why is autonomous driving so damn difficult? You'd think that would be easy for a machine to do. Turns out it's not so easy. Or getting a robot to walk.
Yeah, I mean, partly because when you're making a robot, you don't realize how much information you're processing.
Yes.
You have no idea, because reality is so damn complicated that you literally can't comprehend it. It's impossible to comprehend. And yet, enough of reality is comprehensible to us that you can survive and perpetuate. And over time, you build a model of your environment. So it's an embodied model, really.
Mm-hmm.
It's a representation in some sense of the environment that you're adapted to in this kind of at this layer of action.
Right.
Right. So procedural memory operates in that space. It's an action-based way of living. There's only moving in through the world.
Yeah, actions being taken.
And it's not thinking like with words. It's not that at all. It's just taking action.
Yeah.
Right. And that some action and meaning sort of exists on this level, because there are some actions you can take that produce good outcomes or bad outcomes. And as you start to get a sense of what those things are in the environment, then you sort of account for them without any thought. Like, right. How do you say this? Our eyes are at the lower part of our visual field, are very good at detecting snake-like patterns. Mm-hmm. Okay, so built into our visual system is an accounting for a feature of our environment that's dangerous to us, snakes, right? Who are our most consistent predators across our development. Right, so if it's anything that's constant in evolution,
right,
insofar as there's
that would be like an algorithm built in, right?
Okay, so continuing on with the kinds of memories.
Go ahead.
Bottom layer, you have action-based procedural memory. Mm-hmm. That's as concrete as you can possibly get. All of the memory, all of the learning is happening in the world of action. Above that, built on top of it, is episodic memory. Mm-hmm. Episodic memory uses what's seen, what's perceived in action at the action level, procedural level, as abstract symbols to think with.
Okay.
And so you can create a story that tells you about how you should act in the world and behave and all these sorts of things. And that gets a lot of that information across visually. Dreams are doing this all the time. They're trying to, they think symbolically. They're giving you representations of something from that level.
Right.
And then we take that episodic level and abstract it even further and use really abstract symbols in the form of language that we play with even more. And we can just generate them all the way from bottom up, an action bubbling up through action, through the episodic memory, out through explicit memory. And then we give that to ChatGPT, right, and then it's able to do something.
Yeah, so ChatGPT is playing with the highest level of abstraction possible because it's the easiest thing to make sense of anything, because it's totally fabricated.
It's hyper simplified.
Right.
It's hyper simplified.
And that makes sense, like, from what the data I've seen, too, is that coding jobs have come down an all-time low. So people working in software engineering, right now, as of today, or like the start of this year, was the lowest number in 2024 of reported new job postings for software engineering, which makes a lot of sense given the way you just explained everything. Because if ChatGPT is really good at taking this abstracted stuff and rearranging it and making it simpler, so now what that means is you can have someone who's a really skilled software engineer do the same level of work that it would take, 5 or 10 people to do, because now it has a co-pilot basically to be able to speed up its dev process. And of course it'd be good at doing these kinds of things. Like, that just makes sense. Unless you, like we were talking about this before, it can't connect the dots in unintuitive ways.
Yeah. Okay, so here's something cool. One of the things that we do when we can't figure out a problem is drop to the lower levels to sort of orient us to where the problem is or what the solution to the problem might be. Oh. So like benzene The guy who discovered benzene had a dream of the Ouroboros and then woke up and had the answer to the structure of benzene, which is basically like a circle.
No, that's crazy.
Right. So his dream gave him a low resolution solution to the problem of benzene that when he awoke, he was able to transmute further or abstract more into
Into a
the chemical
solution.
representation that in
Right.
fact was what benzene was. Okay, so and Einstein would take power naps. He had like little balls that he'd hold in his hand, and when he'd
Yep.
fall asleep, he'd let go of them. They'd fall on the floor after a certain time, and then they'd wake him up, and he'd be like, "Haha!" There's all kinds of versions of
Yeah.
dreams and visionary experiences. Nicholas of Cusa was a cardinal in Rome, and he was sent to go meld the relationship between Eastern and Western Christianity. And on the ship ride, he had a great visionary epiphany moment. And he said that after that, he said the least imperfect name of God is the coincidence of opposites, which is this constant unfolding of oneness into multiplicity and enfolding of multiplicity back into the whole. This is a guy, this is an enormous schism between these huge religious powers,
Right.
and they have a difference in doctrine, and he's trying to understand how we can reconcile these things. And he gets all the way to the foundation. What are we talking about when we say God? And he has a visionary experience that gives him a solution to that problem that could ideally be a way of reconciling the Eastern Western Christianity. Okay, so give yourself a problem like that and let yourself have some visionary.
Oh my God, it's nuts.
But okay, so notice what all of those examples have an unconscious to refer to.
Right. And it's almost like daydreaming. Like when you go in the shower, the easiest one is people who shower thoughts, and when people go on walks or do light runs, like just enough exertion, and all of a sudden, whatever problem they've had that's like cooking, like put in the back burner. And that's another thing is like an AI or a program can't do things. It's either doing it or it's not.
Yeah.
That's it.
Right.
Like where we can be like, you could be having an active conversation with someone, but in the background, you're processing something else and you might not even know that you're doing it. And then you'd be like, I got it. Like it'll just flash into your head.
Yep.
You know?
Yeah.
And I get this is totally indicative of what we're kind of getting at is that maybe AI will be this force multiplier, but there's still something unique about what humans do that no machine currently, and I don't even know what we would need to get to this level, can do.
I really think that the way that we should think about AI as it is now is a decoupled neo or new neocortex.
Right.
Another layer. It's another layer where it can be hyper specialized because as the structures of the brain get newer, they become more abstract and they become more specialized.
Right.
And so this is more abstract and more specialized.
Right.
But it's decoupled, right? It doesn't have direct access to our brain and have the ability to draw from the visual and the procedural knowledge and consciousness in order to create new insight into or to coin words, do all these different things that we can in fact do. So it's powerful for doing what is known.
Right.
It's lacking for what is unknown. And if you confuse that, then you're in a Luciferian condition.
Right.
Where you reduce the world down to only what is already known. And as the world changes around you, you'll fall behind and eventually you'll collapse. But on the way to collapsing, if you're a tyrant, then what you'll do is you'll be a totalitarian. Your knowledge system will be total. You'll think that it's total. And then you'll start contorting the world into fitting your preconceived notion of what the world needs to be or ought to be or what it is. And then you'll start trimming away the fat and breaking a few eggs to make an omelet and doing all these nightmarish things in order to make the world fit your fucking idea of what it's
honestly, that's I hadn't gone to that level of it, but that was one of the things that scares me about this decoupled nature of this thing. Because if you become overly reliant on these crazy powerful or what seems to be fast processing, so it's kind of like because it's fast, then therefore it must be smarter than me, right? It's or at least that seems like some of the logic people use for these kinds of things,
right?
Or because it seems to know everything, therefore it is correct, even though it doesn't give you any it doesn't show you its homework, so to speak. It just gives you an answer, and you're supposed to just be like, it must be good,
right?
Which we already know is not true, or at least to some degree is not true. And that's where the decoupling thing is a worry thing, because the more you become reliant on this thing, and the more it's kind of like I don't even know of a good example because there hasn't really been anything like this. It's like basic survival skills in like a Western society. Most of us don't know how to like hunt or something like that because it's totally obsolete for the mass majority of us. In some sense, these AI models could teach us or atrophy our skill to thinking how to connect the dots. Like we've complained about this many times. The siloing of different specialties, so you don't know how to interface with ideas and like pick and choose your tool set. I think we can run the risk of atrophying further by becoming extra reliant on these know-it-all in quotation marks systems. And then when you are thrown in a situation where you either don't have the internet or it's not applicable, but you think it is, then you're like, I don't know how to solve this problem. You know, and now we even effectively maladapted for our environment because we've relied on this thing because it was sold to us as this silver bullet because we love silver bullets or looking for silver bullets, but there's no such thing as silver bullets. You have to do hard work at some point.
There's so much packed into that.
Yeah, I know.
I'll do all of it. Yeah, I know. But the part that I'll pick, okay, so there's one particular.
We can always come back to different parts of this and elaborate further as the stuff evolves.
The lesson in what you're describing is that what we should hold as most important is not the knowledge, but the process by which we attain it.
Yes.
Where we take the process that brings the unknown into the known is more important than knowing the thing.
Yes.
And so that subordinates the AI.
Yes.
Because if what you're looking for is for a replacement for God, and that you want some foundation for yourself, you want some orienting center that doesn't move,
right,
that you can use to navigate the world, and you think that AI is going to be that thing for you, you're making a catastrophic mistake because it can't update.
Yes.
Right? It needs something to update it. It needs something more than that. And there's always a question in this across the histories of religion that, or discussion, in fact, the history of religion is a discussion of what should be at the center of your life.
Right.
But one thing is for sure, it shouldn't be AI.
Yeah. Well, and then that's the other part of this too, is that in some sense, religions are outside of a different structure, right? Whereas these AIs are going to be controlled by companies or governments. And so we're at the whims of other humans updating these things so they get to choose truth or whatever the prevailing winds of the time as the highest order values. That is that's driving the thing underneath, and even they don't really understand what's driving it. I mean, we've already seen how some of this stuff has gone off the rails with early models where, you get Nazis that don't look like Nazis because DEI things. Like this is like they get to choose reality then? Like they get to do revisionist history because the AI is trained not to do certain things.
Well, that's very Big Brother, right? The truth is whatever we say that it is in the papers right this moment.
Yes.
Right? It doesn't matter that yesterday's paper said a different thing. Right? It doesn't matter. We've non-personed people, right? Yes. All this stuff, right? It's the same game.
It's just different clothing.
Yeah. And so I think you never want AI to be something that's above you, that you're subordinate to.
Yes.
You don't want it to do the thinking for you. You want it to go out and find maybe some answer. Or why I love Consensus as an app is because I'll have a question. I generated the question.
Yep.
I have a particular concern. I bring what matters to what is worth asking to the AI. It can't determine what's worth asking. And then with the AI, what Consensus does is instead of procedurally generating me some answer on the basis of perhaps spurious evidence, Consensus gives me the papers.
Yep. Yeah. And all it's doing is summarizing those papers in a way that makes it easier for you to sift through it.
So Consensus becomes a research assistant.
Exactly.
I go tell this poor little research assistant to go find me 10 articles and summarize them, read them, and I'll pick the ones that I think are most interesting to read. Consensus can do that for me like this.
Right.
Spectacular.
That's what I mean. Force multiplier. These are the things that are like magical. Is like now you and the computer are like, you as the human get to do what you're good at, which is synthesizing and connecting dots. Computer gets to do what it's really good at, which is sifting through a bunch of boring data really fast, which humans can do it, but we're not very fast at it. And so it's like the win-win, the symbiosis of human and computer in the right format.
Right. And so there's this really cool way where if you have all these subordinate AI, you can be an army unto yourself.
Yes.
Right. And it can accomplish an insane amount. So that's the promise here is incredible.
Right.
And more than that, the thing that brings us full circle back to the corporate speak piece that we were talking about in the beginning, I think that if we let this persona way of being atrophy so that nobody is actually communicating like that anymore, you'll be forced to communicate from the heart, so to speak, or to learn how to communicate with your whole being again. And it's really a chance of kind of cutting off the bullshit at the roots.
Yeah.
Have a fucking research. You'll have your little AI assistant that writes your shitty emails and sets and writes in the dumb way of speaking
and that nobody actually wants to talk in. By the way, like,
and nobody likes. Everybody's contorting themselves to do it.
Right.
It's all basically because they're trying to sound professional, and it's really easy to misinterpret anything that's written in an email as being more serious than it is. Right, so you say one wrong thing, people are like, "Oh, what an asshole!" It's like, no, he's not an asshole. If he said that to you in person, you wouldn't think anything of it. But it's written in an email, so suddenly it matters. Stupid. Nobody likes doing this, and yet everybody has to do this. And so having the AI do it removes the necessity to practice being like that.
Yeah,
who have no real personality of their own, they don't know themselves, will suddenly have to start being human beings again.
Yeah,
and that's a promise that I'm into.
Yeah, and to learn business email lingo when you could be more useful doing it, whatever skill that actually is the thing you do in your day-to-day job.
It fucking matters.
Right. Like, you're wasting how much of your time to type emails or whatever, when in reality, it's like you could be doing more of the thing you cared about. Even if that means you get to read that much more of an interesting book, or, I don't know, go to the gym instead of writing a dumb email.
Go write letters.
Yeah.
Like, really write a letter. Like, if you think about how people wrote letters in like the 1800s and all these sorts of things, they're beautifully written. Or letters from Romans, like guys that were Roman soldiers and said stuff.
Seneca, his letters were like crazy.
They're great. I've begun Timaeus, Plato's Timaeus.
Okay.
And just the whole way of communication. It's like the sentences are enormously long with a lot of embedded clauses and stuff.
Uh-huh.
So you really have to follow this long train of thought to arrive at the conclusion and the purpose of that sentence, the paragraph. Mm-hmm. And you can imagine that would be an easy thing to do for people who are well practiced in communicating.
Right.
Like really communicating and trying to express what it is that they mean deeply. Right. But compare those to our emails now and then wonder why we speak in like we're writing emails, why we detect all of this is a kind of cheapness to it, a shortness, where in canned answers and I don't have time for this, let's just go. That way of being, remove all of that and imagine if we had all the time to process, the time to right. We didn't lose the quick speaking. We didn't lose the efficient. Set this up for Wednesday afternoon. We got a meeting.
Right.
It's still there,
but we just don't have to process it.
You don't have to deal with it. Right. It'll still get done. If it has a necessity, it exists for a reason. But now we have to get to use that energy as a means of genuine communication, of self-understanding, and the ability to communicate those subtle parts of our experience that AI cannot do.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're hitting on something really important. And I hadn't thought about like thinking about how Romans or, generations or civilizations past had wrote. But if you think about it, right, a Roman today would think our writing system is ungodly atrocious, or our ability to write, I should say. Whereas like you'd think we would get better at elaborating ourselves in a sense. And I will say that part of the reason this Feeding Curiosity exists is in a way to take a skill I was personally bad at, which was writing, and creating a playground in which that I forced myself to do the thing I was bad at. Because how do you get better at doing anything? you do it more.
Add more often.
Yeah, exactly. You got to give.
Eventually, it'll be bad.
Eventually it won't be horrible, and I mean, maybe it won't be great, or you won't be no Shakespeare or something, but you'll still be better than when you started, at least if you keep doing it consistently enough. I mean, even still, it's like being able to string sentences together like this in an hour-long conversation is a skill in and of itself, because that you have to be able to self-reference. You know, it's the working memory of being able to have callback things that were said, 30-40 minutes ago, and then being able to string that together to make it make sense. No AI can do that. I don't know if even if it ever will be able to do that.
Right. And to your point, I think that it's not even just the ancients or people from the 1800s, but even people sort of outside this corporate world, maybe in the more rural spaces,
Yes.
think that everybody else is emotionally and developmentally stunted.
Yes.
It's like, spit it out. What are you trying to say?
I
Why
know.
is everything?
Be direct.
Why do you freak out about somebody's tweet in the way that you would freak out about that being written over an email,
Yes.
instead of thinking about it how you would if you were bullshitting at a bar?
Yeah.
So, because you are decoupled from reality.
Yeah. It's honestly what I worry about too, is in some sense it's like becoming over reliant on digitized information streams. This is like how most, the chronically online types, we might be included in that to some degree. I mean, I try not to be on those bases, but it's like, if we are over reliant, we might be putting ourselves into a reality that's not actually real, because it waits for things that reality doesn't actually wait for. Like if you go out in the real world and talk to real people, or talk to people who maybe aren't as plugged in to the internet, things don't seem as bad, or they just don't care about the same things that the online types seem to care about. I swear to God, it's the weirdest thing ever, because it feels like there's two different realities operating like overlaid on top of each other in this really strange way.
And the people who are really embedded in their experience in the world, in action, in imagination in the right sense, not fantasy like you get in pornography, not fantasy, not this cheap wish fulfillment, but imagination, real imagination, where it's grounded, where you're trying to actually understand something that could really happen and imagining what
the embodiment, right? Like it's the fundamental thing here that seems to be overlooked by the people who are super hype about this stuff.
Right. The people who are embodied in that way look at the people who are chronically online as being decoupled from reality, as not knowing what they're talking about, as being bewitched, right, by a fantasy world, and always chasing nonsense, and that they don't know how to say what they mean. They freak out at any little thing. They don't believe in anything. They don't know what they believe, if they do believe in anything. All of this is indicative of this fracture between a kind of just the conscious space in that lush, entire unconscious expanse that undergirds them.
Yeah. I don't know. It's like we need to touch some grass, maybe put the AI in the digital world. It's like, maybe this is a different conversation for another day, but sometimes it feels like the cyberpunk world is here, just in a really lame version of it, which mostly exists online. It's like cyberpunk looks cool in like video games and stuff, but when it's in reality, it feels just weird. So I don't know. This is a good, I think, primer for how we think about it. I want to write an article about the AI tools that we use here, or at least I use. We talked about consensus, and there's a few others, but I don't know. I think this is a good way to kind of, I don't want to just end up in this place of like being doom and gloom about AI or the potential of it, because it's a tool at the end of the day. If you rely on one tool, it's like everything looks like a hammer, right? If everything looks like a nail, then all you're ever going to use is a hammer kind of thing. And it's like, I think AI is kind of like that new shiny tool that everyone wants to use for every problem right now. And it's like, maybe AI isn't always the tool to use.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So will be continued. Anyone who's got questions, comments, or other places to look around these kinds of topics, we're all ears. But I'm sure we'll be elaborating on this throughout the next year or longer, because it seems like only ratcheting up in advancements or breakthroughs. It seems like, and we're only 2 months in, and there's already been I don't know how many breakthroughs. So we'll see where things go. Boom.
Hell yeah.